So what we see is the hit on Black communities, where we see Black communities broken up. That was a deliberate move to see your power base was taken away from you. Now, you couldn't break up Black communities because move us to the suburbs, they become Black. And you got about 77 core Black communities, one of which is Ferguson, from which Black Lives Matter movements launched, not just under the name of Black Lives Matter. So the point is, we need to understand that there was a basis for that power. That power continues today, though we've been hit heavy, and that basis is our culture. That's really the basis. That's what really inspired people then. That's what inspires them now. The other point I want to make about your point on jobs. The Southern movement was victorious in defeating segregation and getting the right to vote. And they're trying to do everything to take that back, the right to vote. And we better put all the pressure we can on these weak-kneed Democrats to put through federal legislation that goes against the legislation that's stripping that right to vote. And Biden is not making the moves that he could make, as hard as it will be for him to make it anywhere with these weak-ass couple of weak Democrats who are really more Republican than Democrat, including Manson. But the key point is that the Southern movement was effective in what it did. And very often Northern activists, Blacks, conscious, put it down because it was nonviolent. It was successful. The Northern movement failed to come up with a methodology that worked except in one place. And that failure, I think, arose from something that organizers in the North in most cases didn't do. And that was to go to the people and ask them what they wanted. And had you gone to the people in 1960 in New York, in Brooklyn and Pennsylvania, wherever Blacks were in the Bay Area, which is what we did, San Francisco, but in most places we didn't do it. And you asked them what they wanted. When you went to the South, the answer was clear: the vote. That was the answer. When we went to pool halls, barbershops, beauty parlors, churches, alcoholics on the corner, who often were spies for us, telling us who was working with the police and stuff, we asked them one question: what do they want? What do you think they answered, Jane?
Jobs would be the thing.
Yes. Yes. Jobs.
Yeah.
And
because John, see, and we forget it, and a lot of times I had a discussion. The primal motivation for human activity is the acquisition of being able to provide food, clothing, shelter, safety.
All right.
That's it. I mean, people go to college to get a degree, to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to make money, to do what? To buy food, clothing, shelter, safety. Okay. We tried to have a discussion about why we should do or become without understanding why we are becoming.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a critical problem. You watch other populations coming in and particularly setting up in our community. They're very clear why they're there: to make money for the purpose of providing for themselves back home and here, food, clothing, shelter, and safety.
Mm-hmm.
We somehow have ruled that out of our discussion, out of our equation discussion, and expect to somehow arrive at a place. I got a degree, I am a doctor, but at the end of that, I've got a degree, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. For what? Exactly. Have you become this thing? And so now you become an instrument of someone else's community manipulation and socialization in terms of your function. And you don't have a relationship to the community that gave birth to you, and even struggle to give birth to the opportunities for you to acquire these skills and tools necessary to provide your nice house, your nice car, and your nice clothing. Because you didn't understand what the purpose was and what the intent should have been. Exactly. And one other thing I'd like to say about the Southern movement, because I don't like to call it a civil rights movement, because that's a misnomer. Because people were fighting for civil rights in almost every state in America.
Right.
It was the Southern sector of the Black movement. And it was granted a certain amount of victory because of the fear that was posed by the 3/4 of the rest of the Black community. The West, the Midwest, the Northeast. The overwhelming majority of the Black community was not involved directly in that Southern theater, yet most of the youth that was riding on those buses were Northern youth, not Southern youth. And many of the organizers that went South, especially through CORE, were not Southern practitioners, but indeed Northerners. And so we have to really have a look at all of that as well when we do an analysis. And I think a good book also people need to turn to is Harold Crew's Plural but Equal, which follows the crisis of the Negro intellectual. But Plural but Equal, I think, is a much less read book, and I think it needs to be read a lot more because he does a very good analysis of that time period.
Yeah, and I agree with you on the Southern movement. We called it a Black freedom movement, and we called the Northern movement prior to the Black Power phase, we called it a Black freedom movement. We created a Black United Front. The Black United, it was called the Black Freedom Movement for San Francisco. It was a united front. So I agree with you on that. And in going back to the jobs issue, so the problem in the North was we didn't come up with a methodology that worked, because the South came up with a methodology that worked. They won that because they had methods that worked. Those methods were boycotts and marches. Those methods worked. And but in the North, we didn't. But in San Francisco, we did. And what I'm going to suggest, because you and I have talked about this before, the jobs issue is fundamental for our people, and it's fundamental for our youth, along with economic development, business development. The reason our community didn't ask us to go build businesses, we already had them. But what we didn't have was jobs, and therefore most of the businesses were not getting the kind of capital that they should have got. They got some, they had restaurants, you know, barbershops, you know, we had, you know, nightclubs, we had a whole bunch of different stuff. But the key point is, and this is where I think the North missed it, and we better get it now, is after we got the community's resolution, what we wanted, then we laid out strategy. And the strategy was, we're not going after some Mickey Mouse jobs. We're going after industries. We're going to take out industries. And we're only going to take them out if we have the strength to. In other words, find their weakness. We didn't make the mistake that some Northern groups made of the construction site as your major battlefield. That was important. Blacks are entitled to those jobs, but winning those jobs are difficult. You can win those. Going after skilled labor is rougher. We went after industries that we could put out of business. And we would take weak links, knock them out, and then knock out the whole industry. So we knocked out banking industries. We knocked out hotel and restaurant industries. We knocked out the downtown department stores. You know, we knocked out the milk companies because they were then delivering, you know, milk and stuff, whole industries, and many of them statewide. And that was based on strategy. And then at the same time, we did major grassroots organizing, block by block. Another thing we failed to do. When we had coherent, compact Black communities, those communities need to be organized on a whole basis. Chicago can still be organized that way. Many of these other places that are largely
you got Black. A Black community without a Black identity.
Yeah, true.
And what we've been dealing with throughout our struggle in the 20th century was label as identity, and instead of ideology and philosophy as identity. And so there's another factor that we miss in both the Southern movement and the Northern and the Western movement. And that was certain white, I won't call them by their labels, certain white ethnic group who controlled or used Marxism as a manipulative instrument, particularly in the West, Midwest, and the North. And that's that same group who wanted the Southern franchise, but was treated just like Blacks within the South. And so partnered and helped finance the so-called civil rights movement to enable them to win the Southern franchise. because they had an over-educated population, an over-financed population, bottlenecked on aspect of the West Coast and in Northeast America. And there's a good book on it called Broken Alliance, Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews. It was written by a young Jewish guy who was editor of the Boston Globe. Of course, he was fired shortly after he published the book, right? Which is about 20 years ago. Broken Alliance, Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews, because you cannot understand why certain things are happening unless you see the financial manipulation of leadership and of agendas in certain sector of the Black community by another element.
Exactly.
And we saw that with the Marxism in the Black Panther Party versus the nationalism that ended to shooting and death among young people in the streets of New York, Chicago, Connecticut, and even on the West Coast. And they kept, there was a subversion against by certain so-called labor elements of Black people getting control over the schools in the Black community.
Oh yeah. New York, you especially know that.
Right, Ocean Hills, Brownville was one of our tragedies where we saw that thing rear its head. And so the same element that helped finance aspect of the civil rights movement, once they won the Southern franchise, they allied themselves with the same segregationists we had been fighting against. And we got caught in a catch-22 in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and so forth, South Carolina. And we still don't know till today what happened.